In 2022, switching jobs was almost a cheat code. The average person who left for a new employer saw their pay jump nearly 18% in a single year. Today, that same move gets you about 8%. The gap has nearly disappeared, and almost nobody updated their strategy to match. That's the pattern with money. The rules keep shifting quietly in the background, and most of us are still playing by the version from a few years ago. We think we understand the game. We just don't realize someone moved the pieces. So here's what's worth asking. If the old advice about switching, saving, and spending isn't wrong exactly, but it's no longer enough, what actually still works? That's what this video is about. 10 specific moves that hold up regardless of which direction the job market, interest rates, or the economy happen to be leaning this year. Skip them and you keep making decisions built for a version of the economy that no longer exists. My name is Alex, and if you've ever felt like you're doing everything responsibly and still not getting ahead, this is for you. Because the frustration was never about effort. It was about outdated assumptions. I'm going to walk you through the moves that actually hold up, and the one narrow window most people miss completely. But none of these moves matter if a single bad month can wipe them out. So that's where we start. Build the buffer and skip the depreciation. Here's a question worth sitting with for a second. What's the actual difference between a family that survives a financial gut punch and one that doesn't? It's usually not income. It's whether they had cash sitting around before they needed it. Denise Coleman, an insurance claims adjuster outside Tampa, found this out the hard way. She and her husband made decent money, over $100,000 combined, and they'd never carried a credit card balance in their lives. Then their air conditioning died in July. Repair estimate, $6,000. They didn't have it sitting anywhere liquid, so it went on a card. That card was charging close to 24% interest, which is roughly the average rate on US credit cards right now. 18 months later, they were still paying it off, and they'd paid almost as much in interest as the repair itself cost. That's the trap. Before you can grow money, you have to survive the moments that try to take it from you. And a cash buffer isn't lazy money sitting on the sidelines, even though bull markets make it feel that way. It's a decision-making tool. It buys you time to think instead of panic. Now you're probably thinking everyone knows to have an emergency fund. Sure, but knowing it and actually protecting it are two different things. Look at who did well during the 2008 crash, or the market panic in early 2020. It wasn't the people scrambling to sell stock at the bottom to cover rent. It was the people with reserves, calmly buying while everyone else was forced to sell. Even Berkshire Hathaway keeps tens of billions of dollars in cash for exactly this reason. Warren Buffett isn't holding that money because he's scared of the market. He's holding it so he never has to sell at the worst possible moment. So that's move 1. Build the buffer before you build anything else. Move 2 is where things get interesting, because this is the one that quietly wrecks people who are otherwise doing everything right. Denise's brother-in-law, a guy named Todd who works in commercial real estate, leased a Range Rover Sport last year. Sticker price north of $90,000. He told Denise it was going to change how people saw him at closings. 6 months later, he was texting her about a Cadillac Escalade instead, because the Range Rover, in his words, wasn't really doing it anymore. That's not a character flaw. That's a documented psychological pattern called hedonic adaptation. Humans return to a baseline level of happiness after almost any purchase, good or bad. The thrill of a new car fades in about 6 months, and then you're hunting for the next upgrade to feel that same lift again. The lifestyle that feels luxurious today becomes your new normal faster than you'd like to admit. And this is where the real rule shows up. Never finance depreciation. The faster something loses value, the less sense it makes to borrow money to own it. If Todd had financed a Ford F-15 Lariat instead, that's a truck that helps him haul equipment and actually earn money. So the value he gets back outweighs what he loses to depreciation. But financing a luxury SUV purely to impress clients at a closing, he's paying interest on top of a vehicle that's actively getting cheaper every single day he owns it. That's a very hard game to win, and almost nobody wins it. Here's the actual takeaway. Protect yourself first, with real cash, not credit. Then be honest about which purchases pay you back and which ones just quietly drain you while looking impressive in the driveway. But defense only gets you so far. Denise and Todd both had one more thing in common. Neither of them had actually stopped to ask whether their jobs were still worth the 10 years they were about to give them. Audit the ceiling and negotiate the stay. Quick question. When was the last time you actually checked whether your career still has room to grow, instead of just assuming it does because it always has? Todd's coworker, a guy named Brian Whitfield, spent 4 years at a regional real estate firm waiting for the right moment to ask for more. Every year, he got a small cost of living bump, and every year, prices went up just as fast. So he never actually got ahead. He kept telling himself that if he just stayed patient and loyal, it would eventually pay off. Here's the problem with that plan. If your income stays flat for 2 or 3 years, while prices keep climbing, you're not standing still. You're quietly moving backward. Your lifestyle shrinks a little every year, even if your paycheck looks exactly the same. Income has to be something you actively manage, not something you wait around for your employer to fix. Now, a few years ago, the obvious answer here would have been simple. Switch jobs. Job hopping used to be the fastest way to a raise, and it wasn't close. Back in 2022, people who switched employers saw their pay jump almost 18% in a year, while people who stayed put got about 7%. That gap was enormous, and it made switching feel like a cheat code. Here's where it gets strange, though. That gap has almost closed. Right now, workers who switch jobs are seeing roughly 8% wage growth, while people who stay are getting around 5%. That's barely a difference once you factor in the risk, the ramp-up time at a new company, and the stress of starting over. The old advice hasn't completely stopped working. It's just stopped being the obvious move it used to be. So what do you actually do with that? Before you spend 10 years trying to become exceptional at a career, spend 10 hours making sure that career is worth becoming exceptional at. Ask yourself 3 questions. First, the income ceiling. What do the top 10% in your field actually earn? Second, the demand ceiling. Is your industry growing, or is it quietly shrinking under you? Third, the ownership ceiling. Is there any version of this job where you eventually own a piece of what you're building instead of just renting out your time? Brian ran that audit on himself and realized something uncomfortable. His industry wasn't dying, but it also wasn't growing the way it had 10 years earlier, and there was no real path to ownership where he was. So instead of quitting to chase a new job somewhere else, he did something different. He went to his manager with a specific ask, tied to a commercial deal he'd closed that quarter, and negotiated a piece of the revenue instead of just a bigger salary. That's the real shift here. People negotiate salaries. Wealthy people negotiate ownership. The rare moments where regular employees actually leap into a new financial bracket almost always involve some form of equity, stock options vesting, a piece of a deal, an ownership stake that grows in value instead of just showing up as a number on a pay stub. If you're on a team that IPOs, or you get in early somewhere that gets acquired, that's usually not luck. That's someone who asked for ownership instead of just asking for more. Brian didn't get a Range Rover Sport out of that negotiation. He got a small percentage of every deal his team closes going forward, which sounds a lot less exciting, right up until you realize it compounds every single quarter without him doing anything else. So the income is finally moving in the right direction. But making more money and actually keeping more of it turn out to be 2 very different skills. Cut the spending and buy the cash flow. Here's a strange question. Which is easier, finding an extra $10,000 in your budget or growing your investment account by $143,000? Most people assume the second one is the real path to wealth. It isn't, and the math on this is almost insulting once you see it. Karen Ellison manages a dental office in Columbus, Ohio, and for years she believed the only way to get ahead financially was to invest more aggressively. She kept reading about people doubling their money in the market and felt like her slow, steady contributions weren't enough. So let's actually run her numbers. Say Karen wants an extra $10,000 a year in her life. If she tries to generate that purely through investment returns, assuming a solid 7% annual return, here's what she'd need already sitting in her account. $10,000 divided by 7%. That comes out to $142,857. Basically $143,000 just sitting there before she sees a single extra dollar. And that's before taxes eat into it. Now compare that to simply keeping $10,000 she already earns, skipping one big vacation, driving her current car another 2 years instead of trading it in, negotiating her home and auto insurance instead of auto-renewing every year, cooking more meals at home instead of ordering out 4 nights a week. Add those up, And $10,000 is completely realistic without touching her investment account at all. I know what that sounds like. It sounds like a scarcity mindset, like pinching pennies instead of building real wealth. But here's the thing nobody mentions. Wealthy families and family offices spend enormous amounts of time and money specifically on keeping what they already have. That's not a coincidence. Keeping money you've already earned is, dollar for dollar, one of the most powerful financial moves available to anyone at any income level. Once Karen actually had savings to deploy, the next question became what to do with it. And this is where most people quietly make the wrong call. There's a real difference between assets that just sit there and appreciate and assets that actively pay you while they grow. Karen's neighbor, Dana Whitfield, spent 2 years saving up for a Rolex Submariner and a Chanel Classic flat bag in caviar leather, both purchases north of $15,000 combined. They might hold their value. They might even appreciate, but they don't pay her anything while she owns them. They just sit in a safe. Karen went a different direction. She put a similar amount toward a down payment on a small duplex rental near Ohio State, the kind of property that generates monthly rent checks, while it slowly appreciates in value too. That's the real distinction. A watch or a handbag is a bet that someone else will pay more for it later. A rental property, a dividend-paying stock, a small stake in a business, those actively hand you cash while you hold them. And here's why this matters more than people realize. Right now, the top 1% of Americans hold just over half of all the equity in privately owned businesses in this country. Just over half held by 1% of the population. That's not because they got lucky. It's because productive assets generate cash, and that cash gets used to buy the next productive asset, and the cycle keeps compounding on itself. So here's the actual mechanism at work. Keeping money is easier and faster than earning it back through investing. And once you've kept it, where you put it determines whether it just sits there looking nice or actually works for you every single month. Karen's duplex is generating rent checks now. But she's 52 years old, and rent checks alone weren't going to be enough to answer the question that was actually keeping her up at night. Max the catch-up and chase the ownership. What if the years you assumed were your slowest saving years are actually the ones where the rules are quietly stacked in your favor? Karen, the dental office manager from Columbus we just met, turned 52 this year and did something most people her age never bother doing. She actually looked up the number, not her account balance. The number financial planners now say Americans need to retire comfortably. It came out to $1,460,000. Then she looked up what people her age typically have saved. The median for Americans between 55 and 64 is $185,000. Sit with that gap for a second. 1.46 million against 185,000. That's not a shortfall. That's most of the goal simply missing. And Karen's first reaction was panic, which is exactly the wrong response because panic makes people stop looking instead of start acting. Here's what the panic causes people to miss. The tax code actually hands people over 50 a tool almost nobody else gets. It's called a catch-up contribution, and this year it's more generous than it's ever been. If you're 50 or older, you can put $24,500 into your 401k, the standard limit for everyone, plus an extra $8,000 on top of that, just for being 50 plus. That's $32,500 a year, sheltered from taxes, going straight into your own retirement. And if you're between 60 and 63, it gets even better. The catch-up jumps to $11,250 instead of $8,000, which pushes your total up to $35,750 a year. That's not a typo. That's the government essentially saying, we know you're closer to the finish line. So here's a bigger shovel. Karen ran her own numbers. She'd been contributing enough to get her employer match and stopping there, the same amount she'd contributed since her 30s. She increased it to hit the full catch-up limit. It meant driving her current Toyota Camry another 3 years instead of trading up. And it meant that Chanel bag Dana bought stayed a someday purchase instead of a this year purchase. But the math changed her trajectory in a way that the small annual increases never had. Now here's where it gets strange, because saving alone still wasn't going to close a gap that large. And this is where ownership comes back into the picture. Karen's coworker, a hygienist named Wendy Torres, worked at a small dental startup years earlier that eventually got acquired by a larger practice group. Wendy had negotiated a small equity stake instead of a signing bonus when she joined. It felt like nothing at the time, maybe a rounding error on paper. When the acquisition closed, that stake was worth close to $90,000. That's the pattern worth noticing. The rare moments where ordinary people jump financial brackets almost never come from a bigger paycheck. They come from an equity event, an acquisition, stock options that actually vest, a small ownership stake in something that eventually gets bought. When tech companies went public over the last 2 decades, it wasn't just executives who became millionaires. It was early employees whose compensation included ownership instead of just wages. So if you're negotiating a new role, or even staying at your current one, ask if part of your compensation can be tied to ownership. If you're freelancing or consulting, ask if part of your fee can be tied to the outcome instead of a flat rate. It won't always be available, but when it is, it's often worth more than the raise you were about to ask for instead. Karen didn't get an equity stake overnight, but between the catch-up contributions and a conversation with her manager about a small performance bonus tied to the practice's growth, her trajectory looked completely different by the end of the year than it had at the start. She'd finally built something worth protecting, which meant the next decision wasn't about growing it anymore. It was about not quietly giving it away. Negotiate the price and protect the principal. Here's an odd fact most people never stop to think about. $1 you negotiate off a purchase and $1 you earn from a raise are not actually the same dollar. One of them is worth more. Karen's husband, Greg Sanders, found this out while getting quotes for a kitchen remodel. The first contractor quoted them $42,000. Instead of just paying it, Greg did something he'd never done before. He asked for a lower number, pointed to 2 competing quotes, and mentioned they were ready to sign that week if the price came down. The contractor knocked $4,000 off on the spot. Now compare that to what it actually takes to get $4,000 extra dollars through your paycheck. You'd have to ask for a raise, wait for approval, and then watch a chunk of it disappear to federal income tax, state tax, and payroll tax before it ever reaches your checking account. Depending on your bracket, you might need a raise of $5,000 or $6,000 just to net $4,000 after taxes. But $4,000 negotiated off a contractor's quote, a car purchase, or a closing cost on a house, that's $4,000 full stop. Nothing gets taken out of it because it was never income in the first place. We accept fixed prices everywhere without blinking. Nobody negotiates the price of milk at Kroger. But somewhere along the way, we started treating the sticker price at a car dealership, or a contractor's first quote, the same way, as if it's fixed too. It almost never is. Pausing to ask, politely and specifically, can save more money in one afternoon than an entire year's raise nets you after taxes. Here's where it gets strange though. Even after you've saved the money, kept the money, invested it, and negotiated the purchase down, there's still one more decision waiting, and it's the one that trips up people who've done everything else right. A few months after the equity bonus came through, Karen and Greg started looking at a boat, specifically a Boston Whaler Vantage 240, listed at $131,000, the kind of boat you keep at a marina on Lake Erie and take out on weekends. And before writing the check, Karen asked herself a question most people never bother asking. Which bucket is this money actually coming from? If it's coming from Greg's year-end bonus, that's income. Already earned, already taxed, fully theirs to spend without touching anything else. If it's coming from the rent checks on Karen's duplex near Ohio State, that's returns. Money the asset generated without shrinking the asset itself. But if it means selling off shares from her retirement account to cover the difference, that's principal. And principal is different. That's not spending what the money made. That's spending the machine that makes the money. It's the exact same boat either way. But those are 3 completely different financial decisions wearing the same price tag. Wealthy families and university endowments managing billions of dollars all follow one version of the same rule. Spend the returns. Protect the principal. Let the portfolio keep producing, year after year, instead of shrinking every time something exciting shows up at a marina. None of this means selling off principal is always the wrong call. Sometimes cashing out part of an investment account to travel, help your kids with a down payment, or finally buy the thing you've wanted for a decade. Sometimes that's exactly the right decision. It isn't inherently wrong, but you have to be honest with yourself about which trade you're actually making, instead of pretending all money is the same money. Karen and Greg ended up buying the boat with the rental income. spread out over 18 months of saved up returns, leaving the retirement account untouched, which meant the boat didn't cost them anything they'd already built. It only cost them what the assets had already earned on their own. And that, more than any single number in this video, is the real difference between people who feel like they're falling behind and people who quietly aren't. The money was never the missing piece. Here's the thing Karen and Greg figured out that most people never do. The math wasn't broken. They just hadn't been playing all 10 moves at once. A buffer that lets you think instead of panic. A depreciation trap most people finance without noticing. A career ceiling worth checking before you spend a decade climbing it. Ownership, not just wages, as the real lever. And the quiet discipline of knowing which bucket your money is actually coming from before you spend it. None of these are tips. They're the reasons some people's money keeps compounding, while others just keep working harder for the same result. So here's what's worth watching for in your own decisions this month. Before your next big purchase, ask which bucket it's coming from. Before your next raise conversation, ask whether ownership is on the table. Small questions, asked at the right moment, are what separate the people who feel behind from the people who quietly aren't. There's still one question we haven't answered here. What happens to all of this the moment you stop earning entirely? That's a different kind of math, and it's worth understanding before you need it. Your money is either working while you sleep, or you're working because it isn't.